My name is Michael Corcoran. I'm the current president of the Land Heritage Coalition, and we're happy to have you here tonight. I wanted to start with an acknowledgement that we chose to gather tonight on the ancestral home of the Wanguk people of the Algonquins. And we, as citizens of Glastonbury, are the beneficiaries of their stewardship of the land. I wanted to take a moment, I see some familiar faces and some that are less familiar, to talk a little bit about Land Heritage Coalition and who we are and what we do. Our mission is three-pronged. We support our local farmers, both individually and as an organization, and value the legacy of farming in Glastonbury from the standpoint of health and well-being, quality of life, and the preservation of the rural character in town as well. Secondly, we are huge proponents of the acquisition of town land for open space, whether it be for historical or for ecological reasons. Part of our programming during the course of the year is an average of about 6 outings that generally visits one of the open space parcels. And they're casual, relaxed walks and hikes, but generally has a docent that will have some things to share that is relevant to that particular parcel. There are flyers on the table tonight for our next outing, which is usually very well attended. It's Thanksgiving weekend on Sunday at 1 o'clock, so that'll be the 26th at the Hollister White House Preserve. If you'd like to join us, we'd love to have you. We have a docent that knows a thing or two about mushrooms. He's going to be talking about things subterranean. It's a good way to burn off some turkey. Thirdly, as an organization, we understand that Glastonbury's woodlands and watercourses, their wetlands and watersheds, are a valuable part of our town's infrastructure, that they provide ecosystem services to all of us that we receive for free. And it just makes sense, good sense, to preserve and protect them and be good stewards of them. That being said, I want to welcome everybody once again. If you care to join us, there are several ways you can do that. We have posted QR codes in several places on the doors coming in and out, either side of the refreshment table. If you would like to become a member, we have a very reasonable $25 annual membership fee, which helps support all of our programming. All of our programming is funded by membership. We are a nonprofit. There's also, if you want to go old school, there's a donation jar there. We would happily receive a little bit of cash. We're hard at work right now working on more walks and hikes for the rest of the year and into 2024, as well as winter and spring speaker events. Thank you. That being said, I'd like to introduce one of our board of directors, Courtney McDonald, who we thanked for putting tonight's presentation together.
Great. Sorry. And I'm just going to read from my notes. So we are actually thrilled to have state archaeologist Sarah Sportman with us this evening to talk about the Indigenous history and archaeology of Connecticut, the view from Glastonbury. Dr. Sportman holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Connecticut and has worked as an archaeologist for over 20 years, studying the archaeology and history of Euro-American and pre-colonial indigenous groups in New England and New York. She has been the state archaeologist since 2020. And just so before turning it over to Dr. Sportman, we would just like to let you know that this program will be recorded and will be available for viewing on our website, lhcglastonbury.org, as well as on our YouTube page. And we will also have a question and answer period after the program with Dr. Sportman. So thank you and welcome. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. I just want to kind of give you a little overview of what I was kind of thinking about doing with this talk. Instead of taking kind of a traditional period-by-period approach to the Indigenous history and archaeology of Connecticut, I wanted to kind of focus on Glastonbury and on the environment and research that's been done on the geology, the environment, as well as the archaeology to kind of tell a broader story about how and why people came to live here at various time periods. And I will say that this draws heavily on other people's research, most notably a lot of collectors who have done work over the years collecting archaeological collections across the town and working with archaeologists to get some of that material recorded so we know what's there and where things are found, as well as archaeologists who have done surveys in both academic and compliance, cultural resource management frameworks for development archaeology, as well as geologists and soil scientists and environmental researchers as well. Because archaeology is a holistic discipline, we take all of this stuff into account when we're trying to understand human behavior in the past. So I kind of wanted to pull it together with that framework. So let me just make sure this is going to work. That was unexpected. Okay. So before I get into kind of the nuts and bolts of what I want to talk about, I usually like to start these talks with just a brief discussion of archaeology, what it is, what we study, and how we know what we know about the past. So archaeology is very simply, it is the study of past human societies through the material remains that they leave behind. And most people tend to think of that in terms of artifacts, the movable pieces of culture, the things that people made and used. And that is a huge part of what we study in the archaeological record. Most of what archaeologists work with is trash, the stuff that people left behind. Either they threw it away when they were done with it, or because it was broken, they lost it, or they left it behind when they moved on to another location, right? So those are the things like the projectile points we find, the animal bones from people's food. This is a broken pendant fragment from the earliest site in Connecticut, the Brian Jones site, which is in Avon, Connecticut. It's a 12,000-year-old drilled pendant that somebody probably broke while they were making and threw away. And then in later periods as well, we also have the ceramics, the animal bones, the other detritus of life, and that's a big part of what we study to learn about the past. The other side of that are cultural features. So if artifacts are the things that people made and used that you can pick up and take with you, cultural features are the things that people made and used that you can't. Those are things like houses, storage pits, fire pits, roasting platforms, burials, right? Things that are kind of stuck in the landscape but are evidence of people's activities in the past. Lots of times these are identified in the field by the presence of soil stains because human activity in various forms, be it digging a hole and having it filled back in, or building a fire and burning it in place, or burying something, or leaving your trash behind, enriches the soil with organic material or charcoal or something that changes the color of it and makes it stand out from the surrounding soil so you recognize it as something different that requires additional investigation. So these are just some examples of cultural features all the way from a cellar hole to an earth oven to the remains of some wooden posts that rotted in the ground. So just to kind of put it into context, we're using this information, these cultural features, these cultural artifacts, to try and piece together what people were doing in a particular location in the past, right? So I just like to use this image as kind of a way to describe it. One of the things that we find most commonly on indigenous sites is little stone flakes from making and repairing stone tools, like projectile points and knives and things like that, right? That is the result of an activity, of people sitting and doing something, of making something. That's the stuff that was left behind as sort of a byproduct of that activity. The posts from their houses, right? This wigwam would be long gone, but if the posts were left and rotted in place, you might still find the soil stains, and you might find that in that circular pattern that tells you that there was a structure there at one point. You might also find the darkened soil where people tracked in on the floor of that structure, where people walked and tamped down the soil and dropped things, integrated more organic materials in there. You might find that as well if you're lucky. So or a fire pit, right? We're talking about traces of people's behavior and then trying to put these pieces together to tell a story. One of the big questions that people ask lots of times when they have questions about archaeology is how do you know how old something is, right? There's a couple of different ways that we approach this. This diagram is set up to kind of match soil stratigraphy. So if you think about an undisturbed site, maybe where people have been living for thousands of years, the stuff at the top would be younger than the stuff at the bottom, right? Because stuff is being deposited over time, one layer on top of the other. So stratigraphic position, where things fall in a soil column, is one way that we understand kind of relative age of things. Is something older or younger than something else? Okay? Because so much archaeological work has been done in this region, we have a pretty good understanding of things that are found deeper in the soil column and higher in the soil column and how they relate to one another in terms of relative age, younger or older. The dates that we have on the sides here are more related to absolute dating, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this is basically a typology of projectile points through time. So we know now, because so much work has been done and people have put all this together, that when you find points that look like this, you're always looking at that earliest period of human settlement in the region, right? These are diagnostic of that time period. Nobody made stuff like this hundreds or thousands of years after those people were done doing it. And the changes in projectile point technology and many other forms of technology are related to people's changing behaviors and changing ways of adapting to their environment, changing the types of animals that they hunted, changing the ways that they moved across the landscape, the environments they exploited, etc. Because people are constantly working to kind of match up with their environment, right, and find the best and most efficient way to live within the environment in which they exist. So in terms of absolute dating is the way that we can come up with an actual number and tell you this thing is roughly 5,000 years old or 500 years old. And one of the most common methods of absolute dating, particularly in this time period where our time depth is relatively short, right? People have been living on what is now the Connecticut landscape for roughly 13,000 years. That's a really long time, but in times of in relation to broader human history across the world, it's a very short period of time, right? People have lived in other places much longer. Radiocarbon dating is the most common form of dating here. It works really well for sites from the last 50,000 years or so. And so that's a way of telling the age of a once living thing by measuring the amount of carbon inside it. Okay, so carbon is an element that's found in every living thing on planet Earth, and it exists in different forms. Carbon-14 is an unstable or radioactive form of carbon, and it deteriorates over time. It decays. And scientists have figured out the rate of that decay over time. So by measuring the amount of carbon remaining in a dead organism, usually we use things like a charred piece of wood or an animal bone or something of that nature. It has to be something organic that was once alive. We can figure out how long it's been dead, basically, and therefore how old it is, right? So, things like burned seeds or pieces of burned wood from a fire hearth, animal bones from people's food, those are all really good candidates for radiocarbon dating a site. So I think just in general, before I get into talking about Glastonbury, I like this slide. It's a slide that Nick Bellantoni made many, many years ago to just kind of illustrate to people. I mean, this is obviously, all these dots represent identified archaeological sites across Connecticut, obviously blown up to massive scale, right? But to just give you a sense of the fact that archaeology is everywhere, it's all across the site. People have occupied pretty much every corner of the state, or what is now the state, since people have been in this part of the world. And it's a thing that exists in every single town and in every part and every microenvironment within the state. It's something that we should all be aware of because it's part of our shared and collective heritage, right, as people who live in Connecticut today. So Connecticut has at least 12,600 years of human occupation. That date is based on a radiocarbon date from the Brian Jones site in Avon, which is the most currently the oldest site that we have in Connecticut. It was from a hearth feature that was found along the Farmington River back in 2019. although, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a few minutes, people probably could have lived here a little bit earlier than that, but not too much earlier because of environmental constraints. So just broadly thinking about Connecticut, where did Native people live on the landscape in Connecticut? Generally speaking, as I said, people used and occupied the entire state, all the different environments, the uplands, the lowlands, the valleys, the coasts. But generally speaking, most settlement and most time periods were focused on coastal areas and river valleys, okay? And part of that is because those places tend to have generally gentler, kind of milder climates, right? They're a little bit warmer than other parts, and they also have really good resource bases, lots of plants and animal and diversity for food resources. People also made use of the interior and the uplands and lakes and ponds and streams, although oftentimes more on a seasonal kind of temporary basis. And all of that is reflected in the archaeological sites that have been identified across the state. We usually see, broadly speaking, and I'll talk more about this as we get through the presentation in more detail, you know, your big, large villages where people live for months and months at a time are usually not found in the uplands. They're usually found along the riverbanks and along the coast, okay, where small temporary campsites are very common in the uplands. So Glastonbury is part of an ecoregion in Connecticut that has been designated the North Central Lowlands ecoregion. And this basically reflects the local environment, the physiography, the topography, it is an area that is characterized by interior lowlands, right? If you think about the topography of Glastonbury, much of the town is relatively low-lying. It is, as I said before, characterized by a generally mild climate compared to the uplands, say like in the northeastern part of the state or the western part of the state. It is characterized by extensive floodplains and terraces, which are places where people have always really liked to settle, right, from the earliest people in our area up until colonial settlement as well. These are some of the densest areas of settlement within the state of Connecticut and some of the earliest colonial areas of settlement within the state. Has a generally long growing season relative to other parts of the state because of that milder climate, and that becomes important later on when people start engaging in horticulture and farming and that kind of thing. So just to get kind of a more visceral view of it, this is a LiDAR map of Glastonbury showing those different parts, the Connecticut River, the very low flat floodplains, the terraces adjacent to the floodplains, and then the uplands. Right, so there's really a little bit of everything in town in terms of topography. Past archaeological research in Glastonbury informs what we know about the town's archaeological past and the people who called it home over the last 12 or so thousand years. A lot of different work has been done, a lot of different kinds of work has been done. There have been formal surveys, most notably back in 1978 and 79, a group of graduate students from UConn going under the name of PAST got a grant to do a survey of Glastonbury and Coventry. They also did a few other towns in eastern Connecticut to kind of get at broad settlement patterns. And what they did was they did a couple of different things. They went out and did field work. They did surface surveys and test pits in various areas. They kind of stratified the different environmental zones and tested parts of each of them to see where they would find sites. They also talked. They went out and interviewed local collectors and people who have been collecting artifacts on their lands and on other people's lands across the town for decades and decades and decades, right? To gain information about where people were finding things, what kinds of things they were finding, what kind of things they were finding together. And then they analyzed all of that data and did a very scientific kind of report back in the 1970s, the 80s, and that forms a lot of the foundation. What they didn't do in that work was a lot of extensive excavation, so they were really looking for sites, right, trying to figure out where they were, what kind of sites were on the landscape, where people were living in different time periods, but they didn't do any big, large-scale excavations. It was more just survey and testing. Other work that's been done is cultural resources management archaeology. This is the archaeology that's done in the face of development. It's geared towards finding archaeological resources and mitigating impacts to archaeological resources in development projects. It usually happens when a project has state or federal funding attached to it, and there's a compliance aspect of that, so much in the way that we have, laws that protect our environmental resources and our water and endangered species and things like that. There are laws that protect cultural resources and historic resources as well. So a lot of work has been done that way. And then there's academic work. People have done research projects in various places. And as I mentioned before, the local people who have lived in town, who have been a part of the landscape for generations oftentimes, and have collected artifacts on their land or in other places, are a font of knowledge, and were historically a font of knowledge about where sites were, what types of materials were there, and oftentimes had those collections well documented in terms of what material they found, where they found it, and that kind of thing. So that was another really rich source of information. And there in the 80s, early 80s or late 70s, I forget, there was a UConn grad student who interviewed a lot of collectors in town and filled out site forms with the state to get at least the nuts and bolts of those collections on file, so we knew where those resources were, which is really important for planning for the future, right? If there's going to be development, you want to know where areas of archaeological sensitivity are, so you can suggest that an archaeological survey might be necessary before a new development is built. Unfortunately, these laws don't pertain to every kind of development. A lot of things like housing developments and things like that don't have the hooks for that state and federal funding, and lots of times that stuff doesn't get surveyed ahead of time. But a lot of sites were also found during development activities. When a development project didn't require any kind of oversight, people sometimes noticed artifacts or features popping up and called archaeologists. They might have called Nick Bellantoni, or they might have called archaeologists at UConn, or Doug Jordan, who was the first state archaeologist back before Nick, to come out and do some mitigation and record those sites. So there's all kinds of ways that we collected information. But I think the important aspect of this is realizing that documenting archaeological sites, preserving archaeological sites, and collecting this information is really an activity that requires everybody's participation, right, and their investment in. So, in Glastonbury to date, there's well over 100 identified indigenous sites. They span thousands of years of occupation and settlement. And as I said, from that general pattern of Connecticut, the settlements does tend to focus on the rivers, streams, and associated wetlands, as well as the floodplains and terraces of the Connecticut River. The sites include short-term campsites and longer-term settlements and villages. We have a little bit of everything here. So this is just an example from South Glastonbury. This is late archaic features from, this is a roasting platform from the Hollister site, which is typically a site that we think of as a colonial period site, but has this earlier archaic component as well that's well developed and well preserved. So I like to think about this, and I know we had a land acknowledgement at the beginning to open this up about Glastonbury being part of the ancestral homelands of the Wongo. And I think that it's really important to understand that that's not just a thing that was later and during contact period. There was a tremendous amount of continuity in the use of place and in the use of sites over time, all up and down the Connecticut River. So the Wongo and their ancestors, through the archaeological record at least, it suggests that these people were here, they were attached to this place was important to them, and there were certain places in the landscape where they returned year after year, century after century, even millennium after millennium, because they were an important part of their shared cultural knowledge. And part of that probably had to do with the resources that were available in those places, but there's most likely something more to it than that. So, this is reflected in the number of multi-component sites in the landscape. So the Wongo are here in Glastonbury, but they're also, at the time of European contact, they're a native group that's kind of, they're not like the Mohegans and the Pequots in that they're very condensed and centralized and things like that. They're more dispersed. They're groups of closely related people joined together, through marriage ties and other cultural ties. And they're living up and down the Connecticut River, making use of the floodplains and the oxbows with like villages all up and down. But they are a people and they are related to each other. And you can see this in the sites up and down the Connecticut River. There's a series of contiguous sites that stretch up and down the Connecticut River floodplain on both sides, and the first terraces from Portland all the way up to Windsor. And they're just very consistent in the use of place, and these sites are multi-component where people are just going back for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. So I think that that's a really good, kind of indicator of the cultural continuity of this region. A good example of that from Glastonbury is the Ben Hollister site, which is site 5433 by the state reckoning. We have a state system for recording sites. 54 is the town number for Glastonbury. 33 just means it was the 33rd site that was recorded within the town. This is a site that's on a terrace in the Connecticut River. It was repeatedly occupied from about 6,000 years ago up to the final woodland period right before European contact. It's on a terrace near the confluence of Hubbard and Holland Brooks. And, it was excavated years and years ago. I want to say in like the 50s or 60s, I can't remember exactly the date. There was a range of stone tools, pottery, clay smoking pipe fragments, and burials that spanned all of those periods. And I will say that the burials from that site, as well as many other sites, when archaeologists were more kind of invested in excavating burials, most of the ones from this area have been reburied now in collaboration with the tribes over time. So that's a really good example of just a site that was occupied for 6,000 years repeatedly. So I want to get back and kind of attack this by going through all of the Connecticut history, and I think that requires going back to the Ice Ages, the Pleistocene. So from about almost 2 million years ago up to 10,000 years ago was the last ice age. And geologically, the ice shaped Connecticut's landscape, right? That's what cut our valleys, it piled sand and gravel, it gave us this rocky, lumpy landscape that we have today. And the landscape is covered in about a mile-thick sheet of ice until around 20,000 years ago here in Connecticut. At that point, the climate was warming, the ice was receding and going north, and the land was becoming exposed again. That took some time after that for plants and animal species to move in and colonize the area, and people couldn't live here until there were plants and animals, right? So by the time plants and animals were established, probably 14 or 15,000 years ago, the land would have been habitable for people, and they very quickly start to move in after that. So the earliest occupants of the New World, archaeologists refer to them as Paleo-Indians. They lived in New England at the very end of the Pleistocene, so the end of the Ice Ages. The environment was very different here than it is today. It was more like, if you think of the forests of like the mountains in northern New England or up in Canada, very kind of conifer-dominated spruce forests. And they arrived in Connecticut around 13,000 years ago, and as I said, the earliest site we have is that 12,600-year-old component at the Jones site in Avon. We know from archaeology and also from drawing up ethnographic accounts from cultural anthropologists going out and talking to people who lived in subarctic kind of areas in the 19th and 20th centuries that are probably a good ethnographic, what we call ethnographic analogy for people, because there are people living in small groups, family groups, as hunter-gatherers in an environment that was very similar to what people would have been experiencing here during the Paleo-Indian period. It helps us to interpret the archaeological record when we know what those people were doing in the modern period. We know they were highly mobile, that they traveled all around the region, they followed migrating herds of animals. Caribou would have been the main game source probably in this time. It was before white-tailed deer had moved into the area. Because of the deep time, and also because of the conditions in this area, we have very acidic soils and things. Almost everything we have in this time period is just stone. There's very little left. The Jones site is different because there's actually cultural features and other things preserved there, which has been really important. But we have very little evidence of first period people here in Glastonbury, but there is some. There are no documented sites, and I'll talk about why in a second, but there are some isolated finds of projectile points and other artifacts. This is a bifurcate base point from South Glastonbury, from the Horton family farm. That's around 9,000 years old. So we don't have sites from this time period, but we know people were here, at least using the landscape, probably hunting. These might have been things that people lost while they were hunting animals or traveling across the landscape. But it's also possible that some of the evidence of this time period is kind of just lost to us, okay? So I'm going to draw on some of that environmental data now. There was a study that was done back in the 90s now by Robert Thorson at UConn, Brian Jones and Dan Forrest, two archaeologists who were with PASS at the time, and the Adrian's Landing project in Hartford, where they took these deep soil cores and analyzed the soils to try to understand more about the history of the Connecticut River, okay? And that has a big impact on what's going on here in Glastonbury. So up until about 10,000 years ago, well, before 10,000 years ago, the Connecticut River was basically impounded in a giant glacial lake, right, after the glaciers melted. And once it lets go, it's moving fast and hard down a channel, and it cuts a very deep channel. And it's not this kind of slow, gentle, meandering river that we have today. It probably had steep, sandy banks. There was no flooding, no overbank flooding to create the floodplains that we know today. It probably would have been pretty inaccessible to people. And so, it probably wasn't the draw that it became in later periods. And that might be why these artifacts that we are finding are up on the higher terraces. But there's probably no sites along this river. If there were, they wouldn't have survived. Okay. In the post-glacial period, the climate starts to change very quickly. We start out with these coniferous forests, but there's scattered deciduous trees. The climate is warming over time, and over time, more deciduous vegetation is moving in, and the landscape is becoming more and more similar to what we have today. Plant remains from the Jones site, so that even in the Paleo-Indian period, there's actually quite a bit of diversity with plants. We were able to recover evidence of cattails, pincherry, strawberry, acorns, sumac, water lily, and others from the hearth bleachers there, suggesting that Paleo-Indian people were making use of a broad range of plant resources as well as animals. Wetland resources are very important. Climate, there's a lot of climatic fluctuation in those early years of settlement. And big interior wetlands, like big inland swamps, are very predictable sources of food and water, so people are focused on that. You see some large settlements. There's a huge early archaic village site in the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation on Cedar Swamp, because it has been pretty much a big, reliable wetland place for almost 10,000 years. And the Connecticut River continues to play into this, right? So up until about 6,000 years ago, you don't have that flooding. Then you start to get it. Rising sea levels as the glaciers are melting, right, and that water's going back into the system, it starts to impede the river's flow, so it can no longer rush down that channel. And it starts to slow down, and it starts to back up and flood seasonally. So then you start to have the development of the floodplains and the landscapes and the oxbow lakes and the associated wetlands that form. And then it becomes a much more friendly environment for people and for settlement once that starts to happen. Lots of really great resources, lots of environments that people want to exploit, lots of food animals and lots of plants. Okay. And after 6,000 years ago, the river starts to become the meandering river that we know today. It's an incredibly active river. The Connecticut River below Hartford is constantly moving and changing and reworking its banks. And the research that they did suggested that every 1,500 to 2,000 years, it basically completely reworks the floodplain. So the idea is that if there were sites there of certain ages in some parts of the river, they might just get washed away and destroyed and would never, be able to find them. And I'll talk in a little bit in a few minutes about why South Glastonbury is different. It actually doesn't have that problem. So the Archaic period, this period where the river is kind of stabilizing and becoming more like it is today, the climate continues to get warmer and drier, and we start to see larger populations. We start to see an increase in sites being identified across, from all that work that's been done, the collections and the survey work, lots and lots of sites from 6,000 years on are documented. Those sites are more common and they're also larger. So it suggests that there's more people on the landscape and they're living in larger communities on the landscape. The settlement continues to focus on the major river valleys. There's small summer, fall, and winter camps, large spring camps. People are really focused on anadromous fish, collecting fish resources, coming together to get fish resources in the spring when the fish are spawning. There's sites related to that, spring fish runs. Okay, but much bigger populations than we've had earlier and many more sites. So this is one of the things that's really interesting about Glastonbury, particularly South Glastonbury. There's a relict archaic landform here. The Connecticut River meanders and changes and washes away a lot of sites and a lot of the floodplains, but not in South Glastonbury. And Brian's work and the work that he did with his colleagues attributed that to the glacial geology, particularly of the Roaring Brook. So the Roaring Brook once carried great flood of meltwater down into the river valley, and with that came giant boulders, right? Just imagine a tremendous amount of water and still rushing down. And that basically formed a stony substrate below the current ground surface. And that has basically kind of locked the river in place in this area and prevented it from doing too much meandering. It doesn't have the ability to meander here because of the stone that underlies it. So what it's done is it's protected the floodplain in South Glastonbury from that reworking and made it so the sites that developed there over the last 6,000 years or so are still there. Nothing's happened to them. And we see that in the preservation, right? We see that in the tremendous diversity and richness of the sites on like the Burton Farm, for example, the Hollister site, and other places in the landscape. So this time period, like in other time periods, the technology that we see, the things that we're finding on these sites, reflect a wide range of activities because the landscape has become much more diverse. People are exploiting a diverse range of plant and animal resources, fields and forests and wetlands, nuts, wetland plants, fish, all kinds of large and small game. And people's technology, they're living in place longer, they're living in bigger communities, and their technology starts to reflect that. And we start to find these things in the archaeological record. We see projectile points for hunting that have continued the whole time. But we see a lot more tools related to woodworking, brownstone tools like celts, probably for making things like dugout canoes. We start to see the first gourds coming into the area. So these are plants that people are basically growing. In early horticulture, this is coming in from other regions and being adopted here. The earliest gourds weren't used for food, they were used as containers. They were container gourds that people used for water storage and things like that. We see a lot more archaeological evidence of fishing, net seekers, and plummets. We see grinding tools probably for processing nuts and other types of plant remains. This is a time period where people start managing the landscape, they're managing the plants that are available. It's kind of the beginnings of farming and gardening, where people are doing controlled burns to bring more animals into the area, weeding and encouraging certain plants and discouraging others, starting to head towards that farmer lifestyle. And that's all reflected in the archaeological record. These sites are super common in Glastonbury from this archaic period. There's just such a dramatic increase in the number of sites starting around 6,000 years ago. And of course, part of that's because of the river, part of it's environmental change, and part of it is because they're more visible, because there's more people on the landscape. They're leaving more stuff behind. The sites are bigger and denser. There's many multi-component sites, again, that repeated reuse of the same places on the landscape for hundreds of thousands of years. And we start to see large base camps on floodplains and terraces. And that's reflected in a lot of the archaeological collections that people have, both from survey work and from local collectors. One site that's relatively recent is the Dub Road site in South Glastonbury that Brian Jones did as a salvage excavation back in 2014. And that kind of led him to pull together all this information about the Connecticut River and this relict archaic landscape between that and the work that he was doing at the Hollister site. So this was a rescue excavation. There was some drainage work going on. People recognized that there were cultural features here. There were soil stains. They called him. He worked it out to do an excavation, kind of a salvage excavation for a couple of weeks that fall. They found soil stains, They found evidence of earth ovens here. There was a series of these little hearth features. They were all very uniform, where people were cooking or roasting things. They found what they believed was a rectangular house floor. Again, one of those kind of dark soil stains from a place where people had lived and tramped down the soil. And a range of artifacts that dated to the late Archaic period. Small stone projectile points, which made of quartz, small little points. They also found this basalt adze, which is probably a woodworking tool. And this is really neat, a little paint pot. So it was a stone that's carved out, and it was used to kind of grind up pigment to make the paint. So this is, just an example of one of those Archaic period sites. And they really probably just got a fraction of it. It was probably quite a large site. And this is very similar to the types of materials and time period that are popping up all along the floodplain and on those terraces. They were able to radiocarbon date the feature to around 4,800 years ago, these earth ovens, and that's very consistent with a lot of the archaic sites that we're finding in other places in the floodplain, suggesting that there was just a whole complex of these sites in that time period. So going back to the Connecticut River, the soil studies indicate that less severe flooding was happening later on, right? There's a period known as the medieval warming period around like 1000 AD, and this is a period that kind of coincides with the larger scale adoption of farming here in southern New England. And the climate's getting warmer, there's less flooding, and people start using the rich floodplain soils for farming, for basically early agriculture. Again, you see an even bigger increase in site size and population, because once people start growing crops, once people are farming, they can support much larger populations, right? So you get much bigger groups of people, bigger families. But additionally, you need more people because there's more work, and people have to stay in one place to take care of those crops, to manage them, to weed them, to chase the animals away, to harvest them, right? So the woodland period, this is what we call it when farming is adopted. Food production is a key aspect of this. The major crops are corn, beans, and squash. Again, larger population, increased sedentism, you start to see large villages. Unlike a lot of the other towns along the Connecticut River, there's never been a large woodland village site excavated in Glastonbury. There's a bunch of them in South Windsor, and Rocky Hill has the Morgan site, which people may have heard of. There hasn't been one excavated here, but they certainly probably exist. Widespread use of clay pottery in this period as well. The technologies are changing, reflecting that change in lifeways. The villages, the sedentary lifestyle, the larger populations, showing that increasing reliance on farming. Again, we're still seeing the woodworking tools in the Archaic period, a lot of tools for grinding up food, like corn, to process that. Ceramic pottery for new ways of cooking, and also the ability to basically have things like that are fragile and heavy that you couldn't carry around with you if you're moving around the landscape a lot. You're staying in one place, so you can have that. And people start using bows and arrows instead of just spears, probably reflecting a switch to a lot of smaller game animals, the type of creatures that live in and around human settlements. With the adoption of farming, these increased populations and this increased sedentism, comes increased social complexity and political complexity. Okay, and it's when native groups in this region start to kind of coalesce into the societies that we're starting to see when Europeans arrive on the landscape. Farming supports larger populations. You can get more food from less land. You have to stay in one place. It results in increased attachment to place, right? Because these are your lands that you're farming. You've invested a lot of time and energy into them. You feel very attached to them. And it results in the development of local group identities. And this is sort of from cross-cultural anthropological studies. But it also results in more social stress, right? You've got more people living together for longer periods of time. They can't just fission off and go someplace else if they don't get along. So there's more stress, there's more conflict. And when that happens, is you usually start to get more centralized leadership in human societies, right? To kind of regulate that, because you can't regulate it in the traditional ways just by basically leaving or social pressure and things like that. So societies become less egalitarian, and this is reflected in the material culture as well. We start to see differences, particularly in burial contexts, where you start to see people in later period cemeteries buried with different ranges of material culture. Some people are very richly set up for the afterlife, where others are just buried, suggesting that there's a difference in their status in society. Okay, so in Glastonbury, the sites that were identified, this is a figure from Jeff Benjamin's dissertation back in 1993, based a lot on that earlier survey work and some of the work he was doing, showing that increased population size and social complexity, the number of large settlement sites. We started to see elaborate burials, like the ones at Red Hill, that had these trade items as block-ended pipe and boat stone and pottery. Just sort of a reflection of that complexity. Also copper that was coming from the Midwest, suggesting trade networks. The late woodland period, this is the end of this kind of farming period leading up to the period of contact. This is really when you start to see, as I said, the development of the political groups that Europeans run into when they first arrived here in the 17th century. And you really start to see archaeological evidence of separate groups with well-defined territories, and all that goes along with it, the increased sedentism, increased population, intensified farming, and increased conflict. There's evidence of conflict between and among native groups before Europeans arrived, right? In the form of fortified villages, burials with arrows embedded in people's arms and legs and things like that. In the contact period, as we talked about before, Glastonbury was in the territory of the Wonga. In the 1600s, it was under the St. John's Talahib, who came to power after his father passed away during the smallpox epidemic of 1633-34. It was a very contested area at this time. The Dutch were already on the scene. They were working with the Pequot, basically, and the Pequot were vying for control of the fur trade. If you think about where Glastonbury is and where the Wonga fell geographically, their position on the Connecticut River was very important for control of the fur trade, because the furs are coming down from the north, right, and the river is the main conduit for that. So the Pequots basically wanted control of the river valley. They fight a series of battles in the leading up to this, in the 1620s, basically. And after 3 battles, basically, the Pequots win and they dominate the Wonga. In response to that, trying to figure out how to, one thing about the Wonga, as I've learned as I've been doing research on them in relation to the Hollister site, is that they're a group of people who gets very little historical attention here in Connecticut, but were involved in literally every aspect of what was going on in the early historic period. They were incredibly savvy. They were really constantly trying to make decisions and work out ways to survive in this changing colonial landscape. So they invite the English to come and settle in the Connecticut River Valley. And at first the English say no, but eventually they do. In 1635 and 36, right, the first 3 towns are established in the river valley. But the English break the trust of the Wonga, who were supposed to live side by side with them in Wethersfield. They basically kicked them out of Wethersfield. Then the Wonga go back to the Pequots, who they're basically subjects of, and say, hey, this happened to us, we need you to come and retaliate. And that's likely what happened with the Wethersfield Massacre, which really is what gears up for the Pequot War, which of course changes the entire landscape, right, of Native-English relations in the 17th century. Throughout the 17th century, the Wongas work really hard to establish relationships with other Native groups. They're marrying into other groups like the Narragansetts, the Mohegans, the Niantic, some of the groups on Long Island, trying to form as many alliances as possible and basically situate themselves in a good place. Because after the Pequot War, there's a power vacuum. And the Mohegans and the Narragansetts are vying for control, basically, of trade and other Native groups in the region. During this period, Wonga-English relations are very strained, right? They remain strained for a long time. But they get a reservation in Middletown in 1653, and they maintain a local presence, right? People are living in the landscape. Everybody's not on this reservation. They're living in towns, they're living outside the communities. If you read the documentation during King Philip's War, there are Native people living all over the place, outside of towns, in little settlements, in towns, And the Longbooker maintain a presence in South Glastonbury through King Philip's War, which we know through the documentary record and also the archaeology at the Hollister site. We know that they have a fort at Red Hill in 1675 to 1678 during King Philip's War. And that's reflected in the colonial records of Connecticut here, when they built a fort at Niag for the war. And so just a quick snippet, we know that there's a presence on the landscape. We know that native people are interacting with the English in the 17th century here in Glastonbury. We know that there are some good relationships, particularly related to King Philip's War and trying to survive that, where they're working together, because there's a tremendous amount of 17th century native material culture at the Hollister site mixed in with the English stuff, where people are working together, particularly during that war period. And that's kind of, characteristic of Wongan survivance and their striving over this time to make a way in this colonial landscape where everything has changed so much. They're trying to find a way to survive, to maintain as much of their land base as possible, and to pass down their culture and their traditions to their descendants. It's very challenging to find native people in the documentary record in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, but there are some historians that have done some great work, particularly Kathy Hermes, who's been working on a project to do Wongan history and genealogy, and has had tremendous success trying to understand how Wongan people, particularly Wongan women, were working within the existing Connecticut legal system to maintain that land base and to maintain as much of their land and traditions as possible. There was an issue of the Bulletin of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut back in 2017 that pulled together her research, some research from people at Wesleyan University, also research by Gary O'Neill, who's a Wongan potter and historian, as well as other researchers. So if you're interested in learning more about it, I would definitely follow the work of Kathy Hermes, who has done tremendous work on this and is continuing to do so. I think she's going to continue to find that because it's a group of people who were kind of lost to history in many ways, and I think that people are recognizing now what an important force they were in the early colonial period and how little recognition that they've gotten. So, just going forward, I would say definitely check out some of that if you're interested. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Back one slide. Could you go back to that one slide for a second?
Shannon, would you take some questions?
Yeah, sure. And just if anybody's interested, this issue of this journal is available online for free through the Dodd Center at UConn. It's the Bulletin of the Archaeological Society of Connecticut from 2017, if you're interested.
If you have a question, you'd like to raise your hand and bring the mic over so everyone can hear the question.
I could probably project enough, but I'm just curious if you have found any evidence in some of the reading I've done that alluded to smallpox epidemics coming through here after basically 1500, but before the English and Dutch came through.
Personally, I haven't. I don't think that it would be terribly surprising because the European contact starts much earlier, right, than Europeans are actually here on the landscape. People are interacting particularly up along the northern coast with fishermen. They're trading goods, but they're also interacting and trading germs as well. So, but as far as I know, the first documented really bad one in Connecticut was that 1633 one. But that doesn't mean that it didn't happen.
Anyone else with a question?
Have you found many stone symbols in your research where I was reading that they would leave like turtle patterns or serpent patterns in popular landmarks for the tribe?
There are people that are doing that kind of research, and I think a lot of those things are almost necessarily found more in upland areas just because that's where all the stone is. You wouldn't necessarily expect to find stuff like that on the floodplain. But I know that there are a lot of people that are currently working to document that aspect of the indigenous landscape.
For a number of years, I've lived in the Golden Street area of Portland. Have you done any site work there? And I would assume that would also be a wine dump area very similar to South Glastonbury.
Yeah, and it's a similar territory. I haven't done any work there, but there are definitely documented sites in there. And they do sort of, that's sort of the southernmost area of that pattern that I was talking about, that repeated kind of, those sites that have those multi-component occupations. They go from basically that part of Portland all the way up to East Windsor.
I just want to make a comment. Land Heritage Coalition was founded in 1985 and 86, and it was initially the Red Hill Coalition. And our purpose was to save Red Hill, not only because it was would give us a continuous park along the river, a walkway along the river, but it would also had this great Indian heritage, Native American heritage. And I want to recount this one morning when Hugh Ogden and I and Ed Sarabia, who was then the head of Indian Affairs for the state, I think,
Yep.
we invited Ed Sarabia to come and walk on the land because we went to the state Supreme Court trying to save Red Hill. And we spent thousands and thousands of dollars of legal fees on it. And Ed Sarabia walked in and he said, we have to come in from the east because that's the direction that the sun rises. And so we walked in from the east, and he felt as a Native American person the spiritual presence of Indian former lives in that place. I think it's worthy of note that this is why we founded this organization in 1986.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Who was the Wandong competition, east and west, and maybe north and south? And how would they control the Connecticut River corridor and prevent incursions from them being pushed until they finally ultimately were?
Well, part of that, I think, is why they were so interested in creating alliances with different groups of people, right? Because the biggest threat from the west was actually the Mohawk. And they had a huge expanse of Connecticut, in between, but it didn't really stop them from coming into the Connecticut River Valley in Connecticut and Massachusetts and basically terrorizing people. To the south, it was the Pequot. And then, eastern Connecticut was pretty, I want to say empty, but it was an area that wasn't heavily settled. People, used the uplands seasonally and things like that, but there really wasn't a lot of intensive settlement in eastern Connecticut from the river east. So that was kind of less of an area. In fact, during King Philip's War, they were oftentimes were afraid that kind of unoccupied eastern part was going to be a way for the coalition native forces to sneak down into Connecticut and attack people, because there really wasn't anybody there. So people were sending out, both native and English groups were sending out like scouting parties to the east to try and cover some of that land. But I would say, the Mohawks and the Pequots were, until it happened, until the Wangunk were defeated around 1630, were the biggest threats. And that, for all the tribes in the Connecticut River Valley going all the way up into Massachusetts, the Mohawk were one of the biggest threats coming from the west.
Of the different tribes that were in Connecticut. And the second one is, since some of the tribes seem to disappear, how do we even know what the names of the tribes were?
That's a really complicated question, right? Because, the names that we call people by aren't necessarily the names that they use, or the names that the English called them by. And sometimes that was related to a place. Sometimes it was a misunderstanding of what people called themselves. I was talking to Kathy Hermes a few weeks ago about this, because you often hear in the documentation about the river Indians, and it was kind of a catch-all term for the groups up and down the Connecticut River. But she argues that they are Wangunk. That is kind of a misnomer. That maybe the English didn't really understand, because they were kind of dispersed and not centralized, like some of the other tribes, like the Pequots, that they were used to dealing with, and that they were really, you see it in the historic record all the time. They'll talk about the Nyack Indians or the Naubach Indians or the, Indians here, Indians there, and it's more about like where they are living at a particular time than what they actually called themselves. And I think that's more just a way for the English to characterize them in ways that made sense to them. I don't have good estimates for the population. People have done a lot of research on this and come up with widely variable. I think that, one thing is certain is that there was a massive epidemic and a massive amount of death right before the English came and settled in the Connecticut River Valley in the 1630s. And that probably actually was very beneficial to the English cause because it left a lot of good fields and open spaces that were pretty available because people had died off. But I'm sorry, I don't have a good number for you.
Are there any, is there any documentation about clay pits around Connecticut that they would have gone to get their clay?
There's some documentation of it. It's actually, there's a grad student at UConn now who's interested in doing a dissertation and trying to figure out clay sources that people were using for different sites. Generally speaking, people were getting it pretty close to where they were making it. So I don't know that there was necessarily, big places like you'd think of like quarries for stone tools. I think that there's probably pockets of it available in a lot of different places that people learn to identify and exploit. And the question is going to be if that's going to be identifiable using technologies like XRF and things like that. If you can look at the signature of the clays versus the signatures of the pottery and say this clay came from this spot. And the jury's still out on whether or not that's going to really work. Because lots of times there's variability within a particular deposit. We find this with stone tool sources as well. You can get very different signals, going along the same rock outcrop. So it's kind of complicated.
You alluded to the South Glastonbury land not being as typical as the other floodplains along the river. Was that? I was part of that policy site in the beginning, and I remember them saying this was protected because of the way the river was, but was it because of glacial deposits? Or?
The theory is, or at least the theory that, Brian was thinking about, was that the stuff that washed down basically in that early period when the water was running fast and hard created kind of like a lot of stone in that area and kind of a barrier for the river, so it can't really cut into the bank like it would if it was just soil. If that makes sense. And you think that the channel for that might have been the Roaring Brook, where stuff washed down.
Another area like that over on the other side of the river as well, just two where it wouldn't have flooded.
Yeah, it's not that it didn't flood, it's just that it couldn't be, it does flood, right? And we saw this year that it still floods, but it doesn't have that ability to like cut and change as much as it has in other parts of the river. And that's another thing, like that Jones site at Avon, that 12,000-year-old site, that's another place where the Farmington River there is geologically constrained. It has never been able to like cut out of that channel and wash away those earlier deposits, which is why it was buried 5 feet below the ground surface because the river stuck there, so all it could do was flood over the bank and kind of deposit, not cut away. Questions?
Is there any website to get into for like the LiDAR?
Yes. There is publicly available LiDAR in Connecticut, CT Echo, CTECO. There's different map viewers that you can look at there. So there's like aerials that are better than the ones on Google Earth because they do it usually when the trees don't have leaves, so you can see a lot more. And then the LiDAR, and there's one where you can kind of flip back and forth and you can see it half and half. It's a really good website.
Before contact, was there a common language or a common written word that was used?
There wasn't written language. It was more of a spoken culture, an oral tradition culture. There were multiple languages, but a lot of them are related. They're an Algonquin family of languages. So they're different, say, for example, in contrast to the Iroquois languages, which come from a different root area. So there was probably people that could, languages that had a lot of overlap, where people could understand some of what each other were saying, but there would have been differences. So if you think about maybe like, the Romance languages or something like that, where there's similarities, but also differences. But there was a great diversity of language, which kind of speaks to these, individual group identities and territories that developed over thousands of years, even within this relatively small area.
Also, is there a place, like a website for maps of old Indian trails? I know I heard somewhere that, like, for instance, New London Turnpike, before it was New London Turnpike, was an Indian trail.
A lot of the major roads that we have in Connecticut today, like Route 44 and Route 1 and all those, are all based on trails, because those were also the routes that colonial people used first, right, for their travel. I don't know, there's not a website that I know of, but a lot of it is recorded in a lot of the old histories.
Of the stone artifacts, projectile things and such, have you found any that were made from raw materials from, like, out west?
Not.
I imagine there are some, there's trade of items. Have you found anything from far afield?
Not too far, like New York and Pennsylvania materials are regularly coming at certain time periods coming into this region. The Paleo-Indian period in particular, people are using stone sources from a great distance, and that's been interpreted as people traveling long distances every year in search of those materials. In the early woodland period, there's an Adena influence, like some of those burials that I talked about seem to have influences from the Midwest in that time period. We don't know really if that's just ideas that are coming or if it's people that are coming. But a lot of things that come into this area that are adopted, like corn, for instance, right, are coming from the West and the Southwest, probably through trade networks and travel and things like that.
Yeah, this may be unrelated, but is there evidence of domestication of animals, cattle, horses of any kind?
No, there's no evidence of domesticated animals among Native people in this part of the U.S. except for dogs. In the Southwest, people domesticated turkeys, but here it seems to be not something that they did.
And would the dogs have been for hunting purposes, or do we know?
Based on the archaeological record, it seems like they were a variety of things. They were work animals, they were hunting dogs, they were companion animals, and they were food, depending on the situation. Because you do find dog burials that are buried like we bury our pets, right? But people also ate them sometimes, and they were clearly for hunting and protection as well.
I noticed on your charts there was a change in the stone points from very large stone points to smaller. Is that the change between hunting very large post-ice age animals to smaller game? And with those big stone points in any of the archaeological sites, are there any charred bones that you could identify of these larger animals that they hunted?
So unfortunately, there's very little bone preservation from the very early sites because of our acidic soils. Sometimes you get calcined or burn bone that preserves, and people have found, not in any of the sites in Connecticut, but they found evidence of caribou, and then also some smaller animals as well. What they did have that was really interesting from the Jones site is Avon was there was a scraper, a big stone scraper. They sent it away for protein residue analysis, and it came back with as positive for elephant protein, suggesting that it was used to either hunt or scavenge, probably what would have been one of the last mastodons on the landscape, because the mastodons, people in megafauna probably overlapped a little bit here in Connecticut, but they were really on the way out when people came in. And it may be that people coming in kind of helped push them, right over the edge into extinction. Because we don't have any mastodon bones that are younger than like 13 something, but this is like 12.6, and it, it's pretty cool. Mm-hmm.
Would our steep forests have been considered highlands for them?
I think for the most part, yes.
They had a presence there, but totally no campus.
Yeah, I think it's probably more like 4A, short-term camps, that kind of stuff, going for particular resources or hunting trips or whatever.
It's fabled that they named that land. Have you confirmed that name?
I've not looked into it, but. Yes.
You mentioned several sites in South Glastonbury, such as the Hollister. I don't want to assume it's the same site that's at the Hollister Preserve above the overlook. Is that where it's located?
Well, so it's complicated. Unfortunately, there's a bunch of sites that have Hollister in the name, recorded in the site files, named after either people who found them, people's land, who they were found on, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not that same one. No.
Question 2.
Yes.
Where is the Red Hill site in South Glastonbury? I know where Red Hill Road is. It's there.
Yeah, it's basically off that, where that, I mean, it's a development now. It's all housing. Yeah, it's pretty blown out, unfortunately.
Thank you for your interesting talk. As someone interested in this, how often do you walk around and say, oh boy, I wish it was excavated right here? Is that a common thing or
Yes.
no?
I mean, it is in a lot of ways, right? And you can't walk around without looking at the ground. But, it's really fun. It's really nice. I love that I have, as part of my job, the ability to do excavation as part of it and to work with the public and volunteers to do excavation and bring archaeology, kind of give people the opportunity to kind of have that tangible experience with the past. But it's also challenging because then everything that we excavate, we have to deal with. It has to be washed, it has to be inventoried, it has to be analyzed and packaged. And I will say that it is very difficult to keep up with that. So we have the volunteer group, the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, that help with a lot of that, but we constantly find ourselves falling behind because everybody loves to do the excavation part, and the lab work part is a little bit less enticing, like washing little rocks with a toothbrush and inventorying them in Excel spreadsheets is less exciting for people. So, but if anybody's interested in volunteering, the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology is always looking for members, and there's lots of opportunities through them. And there's information about some of the sites we've been working on the OSA website through UConn too, osa.uconn.edu.